Welcome to part two in our Tanium role-based access control series.
Let's look at the other side of our diagram and let's look at computer groups. So, as I mentioned, computer groups are just a group of computers, right? Kind of. We have a lot that we provide out of the box for you to utilize, broken down by different things like operating system or laptop versus desktop, virtual versus physical, a couple of different options. But you can also create your own, like most things in Tanium. Then you have a couple of different ways that you can add members to this computer group. You can use a filter bar if you know it's going to be something simple, or you can use the filter builder to add something more complex. You can use different sensors, you can group them together in different ways. The one that we recommend the most is our custom tags sensor. And this is because once you save this computer group with its definition can never change. If you need to change the scope of a computer group, you would have to create a new computer group. But by using something like custom tags, which can be added or removed with the simple package, you can make your computer groups as dynamic as they need to be and add computers to the scope of this computer group by adding a tag and remove them from the scope by removing the tag without changing the definition of this computer group.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. Computer groups can't change. Once you create them, they're there forever. We really recommend not to do manual groups where you add one computer at a time. That's bad news. Don't do that. All right. But here's where I've gotten burned on this before. I was going through this with a customer, setting up all their computer groups, and they were wanting to do it along the lines of Active Directory OUs using our AD content, and that's fine. But then they needed to. It's like, oh wait, there's another OU we missed. We got to add that to the group. Sorry, you can't edit the group, or it just got really complex. Or if you have a merge or an acquisition, and all of a sudden all your ADOU structure changes, you're moving computers around, it breaks all this. So, what we ended up doing was a kind of a two-phase to build that. We did the custom tags, and then we went and targeted and interact by that OU to tag the machines. And that way we could do two or three or four OUs to get them into the computer group very easily. And we didn't have to worry about the OU structure changing, or maybe a new business unit coming in that needed to get added to the group. Because once that group is in all your permissions, you have to take it off and put it back on again is a real pain. So exactly what Kat's saying here, this is a great best practice. Really encourage custom tags here.
Exactly. You can always change the targeting and the scope of a custom tag so that it matches the computers you want to be part of that computer group. We do have, as Ashley mentioned, the option for manual groups, which can be a list of IP addresses or computer names. But this is a static list. So once you created this list of machines, you can't change that definition. And it's also not able to be used across all of our modules. So it's not one of our best practices, but we do give you the flexibility if you have a one-off scenario where you need a particular computer group with a scope of computers that's not going to change.
Yeah, and here again, I just I would rather see people go into Interact and ask a query with a bunch of computers and just hand pick them out of the list and assign a tag to those and put that in the group instead of manually adding the names here. Just there's some reasons under the hood we don't like the performance of manual computer groups in the Tanium platform as well. So there's a million reasons not to use those. Please talk to one of your Tanium helpers, either support desk or TAM or somebody. If you think you need a manual group, I'm sure there's a way we can work around it. So we just really, it's not only is it not a best practice, it's something we advise against, but it's there if there's no other alternative.
So the one thing I didn't touch on this page is this enable filter option. By default, when you create a new computer group, this is disabled. This is one of the few things that you can change about computer groups after they are created. If I click on enable filter, I get this handy dandy dropdown that gives me a list of content sets that I can assign this filter to. So if I search again, I can find the custom one that I created previously. If you are creating custom computer groups and you want to put them as a filter into a content set, I recommend using a custom content set, as with most things in Tanium. And what this does is it creates this computer group, but it also creates in correspondence a filter group in Tanium. So I can see here, these out-of-the-box computer groups that we had are also filter groups inside of the default filter group content set. What's the difference between a computer group and a filter group, and why would I need both, right? When I ask a question inside of Tanium, and I say, get computer name and operating system, I get my question back from all machines, or any filters that I put at the end. In my results, I can filter them further with this dropdown here. This dropdown is all of the filter groups that you have access to, not the computer groups. So if you want to be able to use a computer group as a filter, it needs to be a filter group assigned to a content set that you have read filter group access to. By default, everybody that gets access to ask questions in Interact gets access to our default filter groups so that you can see all of these items.
And I'll give you an example of that. Yeah. So I'll give you an example where, because I've seen this in practice. Example, you got multiple business units at a company. Let's say it's a manufacturing company and you've got 30 different manufacturing sites. And they drop somebody at site A drops down the filter list and like, wait a minute, this says I can see the computers in site B and site C. I don't own those. I don't want to even take the chances of seeing any of their stuff. They're already filtered out of their permissions. They can't see them anyway, but they see the filters show up that have other business unit names in them, and it freaks them out. So this is why you can put them in the content set. So I've got a manufacturing site A, let's say is Lexington, Kentucky in the USA. So my Lexington filter group only shows up in the content set for people that work at the Lexington site. And so that way you can give them stuff that looks very tailored to them and they don't freak out about thinking they're going to see other people's stuff. That's one example of where I've seen that used.
That's a very common one, and especially why we recommend using custom content sets if you're creating your own filter groups. The computer groups, the reason that they're not in this dropdown is computer groups are not just groups of computers the way that filter groups are. Filter groups truly are a list of computers filtered by what you have access to. But computer groups get assigned to users, user groups, and personas to scope what machines you have access to. So if I look at this user group and I scroll down, at the bottom, I have computer groups. And so this particular user group only has access to the computers that are part of this computer group. So these are your management rights groups and what machines answer your questions. The filter groups just filter on the machines you already have access to from your computer groups.
This is really big. I mean, this is the part where you think about all the different segmented business models, your state government agencies, your manufacturing sites, your banking branches, and imagine any type of use case where you've got segments of the business, they're not supposed to see each other's stuff. This is how you make that happen. So their computer groups are going to define when that user logs in and I type an interact query, I can only see the computers that in the groups that I have permissions to. This is huge when it comes to RBAC.
Yes. So it's very easy to scope your computers to just the items that you need to see, whether that is based off of custom tags, ADOU, multiple computer groups. If you have multiple computer groups, the permissions combine together. So you get access to computer group 1, 2, and 3 that you have assigned. The other thing that we can do with computer groups is if we look at a user and we go into edit mode, if you are editing a user group, or role, always make sure you go into edit mode and don't stay in preview mode. And then when you scroll down to the bottom to be able to modify the computer groups, you'll actually be able to modify them. If you're still in preview mode, you won't be able to make changes. We have this concept of unrestricted management rights. We also have a computer group that is all computers. These are not the same thing. If you grant access to all computers, you will be able to see all machines in Tanium, but the only computer group you will see is all computers. If you grant unrestricted management rights, which has to be done on the user level, It's the only permission that we require on the user level. Then this user can see not only all endpoints, but all computer groups that exist inside of Tanium. So this way, if they are targeting a patch deployment, they are targeting a maintenance window, they can see all the computer groups that they need to target. When you are first setting up Tanium access, we mentioned in the beginning that you have the ability to automatically populate your users into Tanium. When you automatically populate your users into Tanium, by default, they have no access. You have to configure access into Tanium so that you know exactly what they'll be able to see and what they'll be able to do. But one thing you can do to make this much easier is to create a default user group. On the user groups page, you can select your default user group, which means any new users that are added into the Tanium console will by default be added into this particular user group. Most commonly, I see this being a read-only type of user group so that at least people can see what Tanium looks like when they first sign in, but can't take any action on endpoints. From there, you can add users to other user groups. If a user is in multiple user groups, they will get the permissions of both, or you can remove them from the default user group and add them only to a different user group. But this makes the initial setup process when you are first configuring access to Tanium, and you may have dozens of users that need to be added in, and you're still configuring what level of access they will really have for their day-to-day. You can give them a default read-only user group to be able to at least see what Tanium looks like.
And again, with different business units, you'll have to be careful with that because maybe you don't want them to have anything at all until. So that's where your computer group then would have kind of your user group would be assigned to these computer groups. So otherwise, a default user wouldn't get anything, right? Am I
Right.
thinking about
You
that
could have
correctly?
the no computers assigned, or you could have maybe you have a handful of test machines that you allow people to ask questions of so they can get familiar with asking questions in Tanium, but they can only see a couple of designated machines that are in a specific location, not across your designated business units.
Ooh, I like that idea. That's clever.
But it can take time to plan and implement your RBAC setup. So while you're getting that done, allowing your users to get familiar with asking questions or looking at Tanium reporting can help speed the process along of getting them familiar once they get access to deploy actions and take action on their endpoints. And the last piece of the puzzle that I want to cover is our personas. So we talked a little bit about using personas to test your RBAC configurations, because as an admin, when you first sign into Tanium, you can see everything. You can create roles, you can create users, you can do whatever you need to do. But anybody else that's not an admin is going to have very specific permissions that you or one of your colleagues granted. If you want to make sure that you are granting the right level of access, you can create a persona that has that level of access you want to give to the team. So if I still keep with my sensor and package test team, and I want to give them access to, say, interact, to take action and ask questions, just like our users and user group pages, I can see what permissions this grants access to, and I can assign specific computer groups. So if I wanted to say Windows, now you'll note I did get rid of the no computers computer group, but computer groups add together. So the no computers computer group still being assigned looks a little bit messy, but won't actually affect the user's permissions. It's not going to deny them access to computers. It just contains no machines. If I had the no computers and all Windows, then I would still have access to all Windows. It's just a cleanliness, I like it to be clean reason that I removed it. And then here at the bottom, I can add particular users and user groups to this persona. This can also be done on the users and user group pages. So if I add it to, I'm logged in as Tanium and I save. Now I have a new persona that only has access to Interact. So as an admin, when I sign in, I have access to all modules. I can see all of administration, but If I refresh my page to make sure that it all works, if I switch into my alternate persona, all of a sudden, all I have access to is interact. So it's a completely different scope of access. It's not necessarily more access. It's not necessarily less access. It's just a completely different scope. The way that I see this in practice outside of just testing is usually if somebody has different levels of access to different machines. For instance, if you do server patching, but every once in a while you need to be able to audit all of the machines in your environment, whether they are servers and workstations. When you first sign into Tanium, your default persona, which is what you have assigned to you as a user or the user group you are a part of, might give you access to patch the servers, but only be able to see and patch the servers. Then you could have an alternate persona that lets you ask questions, but not take any action on all of the machines in the environment, whether they are workstations or servers. So this way, you have just completely different changes in permission scope to different endpoints, and you can do different jobs depending on what is required of you that day.
Yeah, that's so handy. And that use case you mentioned is very popular. Another one I've thought of is sometimes administrators, when they log in, they don't want to unintentionally take action, maybe of any kind, or maybe there's like certain break glass capabilities that you only use in an emergency, right? And you might put those break glass abilities into a different persona so that somebody doesn't accidentally just hit that action against a group of machines. So they have to intentionally elevate their permissions through a persona so that's added to their abilities at that time. So yeah, lots of good ways to apply personas in an environment.
It's a great call out, Ashley. And yes, you could have a persona that is an admin, but when you first sign in, you are not an admin. So it can be that increase of permissions if it needs to be assigned temporarily in a break glass situation.
And if you think about the user and group population with some enterprises that have identity management platforms where you have to put in a change request and you have to get granted access for a certain window to do certain things. And if you have your directory synchronization set up in such a way that your identity computer or your user groups are being pulled from that synchronization of your identity source on the back end, then maybe for that window during the change, then you've got that persona available. Have you ever seen anything like that as well? Kind of more fluid?
That's not a setup that I have seen in practice, but I'm one person. I have not seen all of the RBAC setups that we have across all of our customers. And I think that's a pretty unique situation and would add a level of automation that would be beneficial.
Yeah, so we can we go back to that diagram? We've talked through a lot of pieces here. And that RBAC picture now, we keep coming back to this picture in the docs because now you see we've talked through these pieces. I don't want to steal your thunder, but now you can see you've got roles and computer groups assigned to user groups, which contain users, right? And then so those users then get those permissions via those groups or the flipping of the personas. This thank you for this walkthrough today, Kat, because there are some nuances here for the person who's uninitiated, and I think you've done a great job walking us through. What would you offer here, just kind of as a recap before we get into some of the FAQs?
So I realized that I didn't start with user groups when I got into the console because I wanted to make sure that the other items that comprise user groups were understood. But when you are planning your RBAC setup, start with user groups and think of user groups as your security groups. What individuals will need access to what devices and what level of access? In Tanium, we call roles groups of permissions. But when you think about a role, you think about what are your job responsibilities. And when you're thinking about your job responsibilities, I want you to think about user groups in Tanium. What do you do on a day-to-day basis? So what do you need to be able to do in Tanium? and what machines should you be able to affect. And that's your user group, that's your core. And from there, you can decide what roles you need to assign, and you can decide how you want to configure your computer groups to grant that access to those machines. But starting with user groups gives you a good central point, and then building upon it. And then always use personas to test.
All right, so I got a question for you. This is good. So, um, there always when it comes down to permissions, it's like what's cumulative versus what's kind of mutually exclusive. So, earlier you said if a user is a part of multiple user groups, they'll get the cumulative of all those permissions. I think I heard that. And if you've got multiple computer groups assigned, you'll see all those computer groups. So outside of personas, is everything that we add in here kind of cumulative, or are there kind of like mutually exclusive permissions?
They're all cumulative on the user level. So if a user has multiple user groups that they are a part of, they will, as you said, get the levels of access from both user groups and the computer groups from both user groups. And on the user's level, that particular user that's in both groups will have both levels of access to all of the computer groups that are in both user groups. So it always comes down to that user level of accumulation. And then your alternate personas are a completely different change of scope. If an alternate persona is assigned to a user or user group, what it does is let that particular user or user group switch into that alternate persona and have that change of scope. It doesn't grant access to that particular user. It lets them switch into a different level of access.
Right. So that's where you get into those kind of mutually exclusive things. I can have read access to all the machines, but I can only have affect change, let's say on the workstations because I'm a help desk user, right? That type of thing where you've got mutually exclusive permissions that are needed by the same user in the same job role. That's where the personas come in. And you can see here in the diagram, it's the roles and computer groups. So I can do this thing to these machines. And if there's a conflict there that you can't accommodate with normal user groups and computer groups, then you can break them out into personas. This is so helpful, and I'm smiling because I know uh, you and I have seen this before, but some people are seeing this for the first time, and the language is all new, the terminology, and it takes a minute to absorb this. So if you're just now getting started with Tanium RBAC, it's an advanced topic for any solution out there in the industry, and Tanium's no different. So take some time to watch this video a couple times till it starts to sink in and it starts to make sense. Because as anytime you're learning something new, it might take a few times to get it. So, what kind of troubleshooting things could we walk through? So, I can just imagine, hey, I've got my permissions, but I log in and I can't see. Wait a minute, I'm supposed to see these computers. I can't see those computers. And I've got the group assigned, but I'm not seeing those computers. What could be the problem?
Yeah, so if I sign into Tanium and I ask a question, the easiest question to identify if you have access to a particular computer is obviously computer name. I can ask computer name from all machines. The one thing I would recommend if you are troubleshooting RBAC access, or if the machine is responding to your questions, is switch to the cached view of computer name so that you can see both endpoints that are online and not currently online, because the endpoint could just be offline. And if you still don't see the devices that you expect, you may have computer groups assigned, but the computer may not meet the requirements of that particular computer group. In the example of custom tags, maybe that machine doesn't have the custom tag that makes up the computer group. And that's something that I would recommend reaching out to your Tanium admin and just asking them to verify that the computer that you're looking for meets the requirements of the computer groups that are assigned to you.
All right. So let's kind of walk through some scenarios. Okay, I didn't see the computer. Now let's say I don't see the module. So I'm a department user in a company. I open a request, I get added to this. I need this module for my job function. Let's say I'm looking at comply and vulnerability management. And so they close a ticket. Yes, you're granted the comply, but I log in and I don't see comply. Where might I look to find that?
There's two places that you can look for modules. You can click on the modules icon and see if you see it in the dropdown or on the home page, depending on your home page customization. I will call that out. You can see the modules that you have access to in this section. If you don't see the module listed here or in the sidebar, either the Tanium admin didn't grant you a role that has access to that module, one of our out-of-the-box roles, or when they created a custom role, they forgot that show permission that we saw. If you don't have interact show, you're not going to see the interact module. So if you don't have comply show, which is a part of all of our comply provided roles, but if there's any customization, if you don't have comply show, you won't be able to see this comply module.
One other thing I was thinking of, those are great. I didn't think of a few of those, but also it could be buried in a persona. Why don't you go through the personas very slowly again? Because I know we clicked through that pretty quick earlier. It's under your user prefer or user icon in the top right corner. And so you could have a list of multiple personas there, and maybe they put it into a different persona that you've got to elevate to see it.
If you don't have any alternate personas assigned, you will not see this persona section inside of your user icon. If you do have alternative personas assigned, you will see this persona section. If you click on it, you can see all of the personas that you have assigned to switch into. And if the access was granted to a different persona, you can switch into your personas to verify if you have access to comply. And this one, I just granted access to interact. So I only have access to interact.
All right, so you've got access to interact, and then we go into interact, and I was like, wait a minute, I've got my query of machines here, and I want to deploy an action to them, but oh my goodness, they didn't give me the deploy action button. So when I check the box, it's supposed to light up these buttons. Now in this case, we see it, but notice here, this is really interesting to see all these little buttons that light up when you check the box. There's permissions behind those. So what if the deploy action button's missing?
When we check this box, to display this deploy action button, we require write action permissions. I like to use out-of-the-box roles, especially for interact, because there's only a couple of permissions assigned. So if we're looking at our out-of-the-box roles, they only granted you access to ask questions in Tanium, not deploy actions. What you would want to do is reach out to your Tanium administrator, ask them to grant you the ability to deploy actions. They can give you interact power user, or they can grant those permissions explicitly inside of a custom role. We always recommend using out-of-the-box roles, especially in these types of situations for troubleshooting purposes, but they can grant you that next level of access because we can give you the ability to ask questions, create reports without giving you the ability to affect endpoints. That's a next level of access.
Yeah, thank you so much for this tour because I know we've been deliberate stepping through each piece of the RBAC model because there's so much and some nuance here. Like you said, you've got to go into that role, make sure this little box is checked on this permission, right? So thank you. You've given us a great way to get started here. I'd like to give it back to you just for some closing remarks here. Any best practices you want to reiterate or common things that people get tripped up on you'd want to just reiterate as we close today?
I will circle back to my handy dandy quick links page. All of the modules that we have in Tanium, all of the different solutions that you can grant access to have out-of-the-box roles. Please use them as much as possible. This way, you know exactly what level of access you're granting. It makes it much easier when you're troubleshooting if additional access is needed or if a user is not seeing what they expect to. And as anything changes, as we add new features to modules, now that we have the ability to use custom content sets in deploy, we added in new roles. So as you do your RBAC verification once a year, or if you're brand new, going to these pages and looking at what is available today in our out-of-the-box roles helps you stay up to date and have access to everything in Tanium that you need to.
clearly your experience and expertise in serving customers in this role as an RBAC expert has come to bear here today as you've walked us through what are the difference between personas and computer groups and user groups and content sets and how to use each one of these things. So thank you, Kat, for walking us through today. And to those of you who are watching, like I said earlier, this is a big topic. Even for me, as an experienced Tanium admin of years and having industry experience, it took me a little bit to get my head wrapped around this. And if it were me and I were just getting started, I would take that image from the help that she used as that diagram. I would set that to like my desktop wallpaper or something, like, or print it and post it in my cube or on my wall at home somewhere, because that diagram is going to be your saving grace. It's going to help you navigate where these things go. So go into the docs. All the links are here that Kat was using today, just in the show notes below in the description of the YouTube video. Go in there, read through those, and then, as always, if you need any help, feel free to reach out. But I think you've got a great start with today's video and using those links. So there you go. That is our getting started with Tanium RBAC. We hope that's helpful. And until next time, Go Tanium.